G'day, my name is Nick, and in today's diorama, we're pitting Wolverine against Darth Maul. Getting started on the base for this diorama, we're going to revisit Alkali Lake again, specifically the snowy scene where Wolverine visits the destroyed research facility that Stryker was once running in X2. I want to have Wolverine and Darth Maul locked in an epic battle in front of this snowy dam wall looking structure. I want to create an underwater section in the diorama, which I will hopefully later on add some snow effects to create sort of a frozen lake looking effect, which both characters will be fighting on top of. To create the ground and concrete wall dam structures, I'll begin to build up layers of XPF foam, cutting them to shape using my hot wire foam cutter. After gluing a couple pieces together, I can then angle the wire on the foam cutter to create the sloping sections of the dam wall. To recreate the section in the middle of the wall where the door is that Wolverine enters through, I'll have to cut halfway through the foam and then carefully and quickly pull the piece back out so it doesn't cut it in half. After which I can cut through the back of that section to remove that chunk of wall. Big thanks to these two comments who both suggested Wolverine vs Darth Maul for a diorama. I thought it was an epic idea. After gluing a vertical section on top of the diagonal part, I can now attach the dam wall onto the base using a bit of hot glue. XPF foam will usually come with a smooth exterior from the factory. While cutting with the hot foam wire cutter, it will create a more rough texture on the foam. Because I want to create a concrete wall, I need to make sure to use the smooth side on the outside to mimic the flat and smooth finish of concrete. I can now begin to cut out all the concrete panel sections to try and recreate the dam wall from the research facility. With all the concrete pieces cut out, I can then use some hot glue and just start to build out the concrete panel details. Luckily, I don't need to be 100% perfect at this stage because I'll be doing a lot of weathering and texturing in the next step, which will hide a lot of the imperfections. Now the panels are all glued in place, the last step is just to add one flat section on top to serve as a roof and hide all the seam lines between the foam panels. Now that I've got all the foam stuck on, I can come back in with a hobby knife and start chipping away and creating some weathering and texturing on this dam wall. Grabbing my hobby scalpel, I'll throw a flesh blade into it and then begin to scrape and score the foam edges where damage and weathering would naturally build up and occur on a concrete wall, using the movie scene as a reference. I didn't really have a specific technique here, I just sort of began to have a scrape and a play and just saw what felt natural and gave a realistic looking result. The last step was just to grab this metal brush and add some variation to the weathering and help scrape out some of the loose bits of foam. I can then give everything a nice base coat of foam safe black spray paint. While we let the paint dry on the base, we'll start working on the characters. The Darth Maul STL I purchased from CG Trader from an artist called the SKA Zone, while Wolverine was purchased from Nico Industries, and since we're going with the comics accurate Wolverine costume, we're going to have to go with the comics accurate height for Wolverine. He's not short, he's just, compact and an efficient little killing machine. After I've got all the parts cleaned and sanded, I'll fit them together just to make sure all the parts line up and there aren't any large gaps. They're looking all good, so it's time to start painting. Starting with Darth Maul, I'll give his body and his head a red base coat. The rest of his clothing is black, so I'll just keep it as the base coat colour. Now, grabbing my brush, I can begin to carefully paint on the tattoos on his face. The fine tattoos across the front of his face were seriously small, so it was time to get out my goofy ass little hobby goggles. I can then carefully just fill in all the line sections across his face. Luckily, the 3D model had the tattoos sort of imprinted in there, so I could just sort of follow in and fill in the lines. Doing this freehand would be pretty much impossible, to be honest. And with that, the tattoos are finished. I can move on to painting in some of the other finer details. For Darth Maul's eyes, I'm going to use 3 regressively brighter oranges and yellows. Starting with a saturated red, I'll create a circle covering the entire iris. Then coming in with an orange, I'll create a small circle. This will start to build up the gradient of Darth Maul's sort of Sith eyes. Lastly, a bright yellow for the center, and then I can add a black pupil into each eye. I'll then build up some shades of bone colour on his horns. And with that, Darth Maul's head is done, and I can move on to painting the tattoos on his torso. This will be exactly the same process as his head, just filling in those tattoo lines with the black paint. And with that, the paint job on Darth Maul is done, and I can move on to Wolverine. I'll start by base coating all the parts in a black, and then coming from the top with a white to pick up all the details and give it a highlight. Then using some masking tape, I'll mask off different areas to block paint from ruining that white highlight. To create these skin tones, I'll start with a rosy red base coat, and then coming down from the top with a more pale skin colour. This will then just create a contrast to the skin tone. Now, grabbing some silly putty, I'll use that to mask off areas where I want to avoid paint overspray, and then continue on painting the skin tone on Wolverine's arms. I'll then continue on base coating the rest of the parts of Wolverine. It's kind of funny how the side of Wolverine's mask looks a bit like Batman. I'll come in on his shoulder pads with this semi-metallic gunmetal blue. And lastly, just painting in some metallic silver on those adamantium claws. And with that, the airbrushing is done, and I can move on to painting the finer details on Wolverine. Starting with his mouth, I'll base coat his tongue and teeth, and then just go over the top of everything with a reddish brown wash to colour the gums and give some depth to the mouth details. I can now glue all the parts of Wolverine together using some super glue. For Darth Maul, it's a little bit more complex because I need to feed some wires through the parts. In Blender, before I printed the parts out, I created a small little hole that circles all the way through from the end of the lightsabers all the way down through Darth Maul's foot. This way I can feed wires all the way through his body and keep those hidden, but still power the LED hue filaments, which I'll be using to create the effect of the lightsabers. In my previous Cyclops versus Superman build, I didn't create these holes and just sort of smashed out the supports that are inside the hollow parts, but this was a lot easier, so I'm definitely going to create this sort of whole tube that goes through the body of the parts in all my future builds from now on. At this point, with the wires hanging from his torso, it really was looking like he was in the middle of his reconstruction. And the last step is just to feed all the wires finally through his waist and out through his foot, and I can glue his upper half to his legs. With the characters all done, we can now move back onto the base. Coming back to the base, I'll start with a white highlight using my airbrush. I'll then grab a few different shades of grey to start adding some textured variation to the concrete. Concrete is never really a flat grey in the real world, so I'll use these different shades to build up layer upon layer of blotchy spots using a little piece of ripped sponge. This will create a much more realistic looking concrete than if I just left it a flat grey. So the next step was going to be to add a black wash across all the concrete surfaces, but I may have possibly just maybe spilt my black wash absolutely everywhere. But, you know, hey, when life gives you spilt black oil wash, you make, yeah, well, I don't really know what you'll make, but I wasn't going to waste it, so I may as well just keep using the black oil wash. I'll then just cover the entire concrete section of the model with the oil wash. This will flow down into all the cracks and crevices that we previously made with the hobby knife. After cleaning up the mess, I can then come back in with a foam sponge and remove the oil wash from the raised sections. This will just then leave the black pigment in the cracks, helping to create more contrast and depth to the weathering effect. In areas where I felt like the oil wash didn't build up enough, I'll come in with a finer paintbrush and manually add in black wash to those sections. Using my 3D printer, I printed off some large doors which I'll then paint with some metallic bronze. I can then do the same weathering effect of covering the entire piece with black oil wash and then coming back in after it's removed from the raised sections. I'll then glue it in place just using some hot glue. Next, I'll create the base for the underwater section of the diorama using some sculptor mold. Mixing the sculptor mold powder with some water, I can then apply the paste to the XPF foam that we cut out previously. I had to make sure to be really careful not to get the paste onto the sections of the diorama we previously painted, because it would be really annoying to get that off once it was dry. So I used a little spatula just to help me get into those nooks and crannies. To attach the rocks to the sculptor mold base, I'll use some PVA glue and spread that in a thick layer. This will let the rocks stick in place. I'll start by sprinkling out some coarse ballast and then coming over the top of that with some more pebbles and rocks. I'll then place down a few plaster rocks which I previously created just to add some variation to the sizing. I'll then tie everything together with a coat of fine dirt. Once I'm happy with how that looks, I can continue on with the rest of the diorama. I'll use some isopropyl alcohol and some water-damp PVA just to soak all the dirt and rocks to make sure everything is secured down. Next, just add a bit of variation and get some different shades of colour. I'll come in with some oil washes and just loosely and sporadically apply that across different areas. Now I want to create some barbed wire fence which will line the top of the dam wall. To create this, I'll grab some balsa wood and cut it down into about 15 sticks of equal length. But before I actually create the barbed wire fence, I'm just going to have to quickly put my gloves into sports mode. To create the fencing, I'll grab a straight length of wire, which I can then wrap a thinner gauge of wire around in an alternating pattern to create the barbed points which normally occur on barbed wire. In all honesty, I cut the tips off my gloves because they kept getting caught as I was wrapping the wire around the larger one. After some very sore hand muscles and quite painful fingertips, the wrapping of the wire was done. I can then come in with some snips and just cut off the excess to leave the barbed points. I'll then just give the wooden poles a lick of paint and a bit of an oil wash just to stain them and make them look a bit weathered. I'll then get all the wooden poles stuck into the diorama and superglue the barbed wire fence onto those wooden poles. In the X2 movie, there are a whole bunch of oil dross strewn about in front of the dam wall, so I wanted to create a bit more of a story in my diorama by adding some mutant fish into the water that have been mutated by the hazardous chemicals that Stryker's been using at his research facility. I'll quickly give them a coat of paint and then fasten them onto the diorama using some UV cure resin and some clear acrylic rods. I'll then just add a bit of greenery to the underwater scene using some super glue and some fake little hobby plants. When that's all dry, I can then start to prepare the 2-part epoxy resin to pour the water section of the build. In my last 2 builds, I've messed up the resin by adding way too much pigment, so this time I was really careful to just add a few drops to my stirring stick and then add that to the resin. Speaking of messed up resin, if you watched my last video, you would have seen that I completely ruined my first batch by adding way too much pigment again. So I decided not to waste it by pouring it into some rock molds that I had, hoping I could use it in this build. I'm actually going to use these rocks to create some mini icebergs and cracked ice boulders that you sometimes see on frozen lakes. I really wish that I had sprayed some mold release in first, but I was in such a rush and now they are almost impossible to get out. Once the resin water is cured, I can place the ice rocks on top and then pour down a second layer to encapsulate and lock them in place. This will also create another layer which should hopefully look like an ice sheet on top of the lake's water. Before this layer cures, I'll also place some oil barrels in the water. Now, before I start applying the snow powder effects, I really need to mask off the areas where both models will be super glued to the ice lake. Otherwise, I won't be able to get a good bond between the diorama and the models. To do this, I'll just place down some masking tape in the approximate shape of both of their feet. I can then remove this at a later stage to glue them down. To create the snow powder effect, I'll be using soft flake snow from Woodland's Nynx. I'll start by spraying the entire model with spray adhesive. I can then come over the top using a sieve and gently sprinkle the snow powder across all the areas that I want snow to be built up. In certain areas where I want it to appear like snow has been swept in by the wind, I'll just lightly clump it and toss it out of the sieve and repeat this across all the exposed areas of the diorama. To seal all the snow down, I'll once again use some isopropyl alcohol and some watered down PVA glue. I wanted to add a bit of green toxic sludge spilling out of one of the oil barrels, so I mixed up some green neon pigment with some UV cure resin, which I can then pour into the oil barrel and cure using some UV light. I repeated that process to try and create some icicles which were hanging from the edges of the dam wall. It turned out okay, but I think there was definitely a better way to do it, which I just haven't figured out yet. To create the glowing laser blades of Darth Maul's lightsaber, I'm going to use some LED filaments. I'll cut a short section of brass rod to give the LED filament some structure and keep it straight. I'll first solder some electrical wire to the end of the LED filament, and then solder the LED filament to the brass rod. After everything is attached together, I can pull the brass rod and LED filament down through Darth Maul's lightsaber, pulling the wires all the way through the tube we cut into Darth Maul's body. I'll then repeat the process on the second lightsaber and Darth Maul is done. The last step now is just to remove the masking tape underneath the snow powder to leave a clear section of resin. I can then attach both Wolverine and Darth Maul to the diorama using some super glue. Thanks again for checking out my video. Let me know down in the comments which two different characters from anime or TV shows or movies that I should battle against each other in my next diorama build. Cheers and check out the reveal.